All right, so welcome to this CVSP 203 lecture on the state and social contract. The star of the show today is going to be Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but I will be dealing with, preemptively, I'll be doing some introduction to Locke and Hobbes, not in that order, Hobbes then Locke, and then we'll be moving on to Rousseau, and Rousseau himself provides a lot of material and commentary on what he thinks about them. In fact, one can see Rousseau's Discourse on the Origin of Equality, 1755, as being in many ways a response, a critique, an undermining response to the pretensions of Hobbes and Locke's theories and the degree to which they were influential. So let me begin that the modern social contract edition in many ways starts with Thomas Hobbes in the late 17th century. Its purpose was to try to conceive of the relationship between state and citizen as a kind of agreement and the terms that would create a legitimate foundation for political authority, one that people should obey. While Hobbes's notion of the state and its imbalanced empowerment of the state over citizen, he was an authoritarian, at least his theory was, may seem difficult for us to accept today, his logic nevertheless embarrasses our complaints by its abundance in the present. That is, variations of authoritarianism are in many ways the norm in the world we live in today. John Locke's ideas, on the other hand, of the state and the ideal of private property to which he entrusts it has seemed to many to be far more equitable and just than Hobbes's, as a balancing of the interests of public and private power. Indeed, Locke's thought is entrenched in the American Constitution and has had a tremendous influence on mainstream thinking that calls itself liberal, in the belief that rights, capacities, and the property of the individual are the sacred trust which calls forth the state. The state exists in order to serve these interests. While Hobbes's theory of state initiated the idea that citizens are due some small measure of right in exchange for duty and obedience, Locke moved in a different direction and regarded the primary purposes of power to be the securing of individual liberty, which at its core was one form or another of property holding. Private property. While Hobbes to this day holds special prowess in the field of international relation for his understanding of the anarchic system of international relations and state actors, right? Locke has a special place of preeminence among political theorists who are more concerned with the preservation of personal interest and liberties in the face of the intrusions of state authority, right? Locke more interested in the protection of individual liberty and Hobbes more with the state, right? Yet another voice, I argue, stands out and outshines both Locke and Hobbes. And this, I think, will come out in the talk. This is the voice of the young Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and the Rousseau of the second discourse is really the young Rousseau, I was about to say Descartes. The young Rousseau is a more idealistic, a more romantic, a more passionate Rousseau than the older Rousseau of, say, the social contract. Each of these three authors, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, provided a theory of how humans lived at their beginning in the state of nature, right? A prehistorical, right? Original, pre-political, pre-civilizational conception of how we lived in the state of nature, right? And the essential human nature, each of these authors understood as disclosing the true character, right? Our true human nature behind the mask of civilization, right? Which we all wear. We all smile at each other and say, excuse me, right? Especially if you're a Canadian like me. By looking backwards, all three authors argued that we could best understand who we really are today, right? And how we ought to live together. The state of nature as a thought experiment for these three authors was really a mix of many things. It was one part deduction from new scientific methods and principles, one part the reports of explorers who had traveled to the Americas and other shores beyond Europe, and finally, one part the ideological battle for the hearts and minds of social and political Europe, modern social and political Europe. The first two influences are fairly straightforward and clear. Each of these authors supported their theories with naturalistic conceptions of human understanding, language, or psychology. As well, each had access to the reports from the colonies and newly explored regions that described the technological simplicity, right? The simplicity within which human lived in tribal societies, which they took to be primitive and a reflection of how we all lived at the beginning. They took these reports as providing access to the original way all humans lived before the development of institutions that form the basis of what we call civilization, right? The state, these sorts of institutions of civilization are the state, law, education, medicine, etc. Yet, while they shared these sources in common, the conclusions these authors came to regarding the ideal social and political contract between the ruler and the ruled, right, are marked by serious disagreement, right? Very different. For Hobbes, our time in the state of nature exposed us to an anxiety and fearfulness that all but imposed a state of war between peoples. In essence, all had to participate in this war lest they fall behind others who would eventually invade. You got to keep up with the Joneses, right? Otherwise, they're going to invade you. So nobody can avoid war, right? The anxiety, pervasive anxiety of the state of nature, nobody escapes. The only road out of this mess for Hobbes was to agree to hand over power to a single ruler, against whom the citizen would have little room for resistance or complaint. For Hobbes, the one-sided bargain between citizens and their leaders was a necessary evil, right? We all hand over power to a greater authority who alone holds the monopoly on power and violence, or we will remain in a perpetual state of war, one against the other. John Locke took serious issue with this arrangement. Handing over all of our natural liberties to a ruler, he argued, merely puts us in a new state of jeopardy, a new state of nature, right? Where we are all now threatened by the unlimited power of one rather than the power of many that we encountered in the state of nature. Neither did Locke suggest, as Hobbes did, that war was our condition in the state of nature. Rather, the absence of a judicial authority to resolve disagreements and the messiness of private justice, right, where we take justice into our own hands because there's no judge, right, created a degree of chaos in the state of nature that jeopardized what Locke took to be as the most sacred thing to us, private property, right? Got to get out of the state of nature so we can enjoy our private property in peace, right? For Locke, all roads led to the sacred right of property. I argue all roads do lead to the sacred right of property for Locke, and the democratic right-based political arrangement he set up to resolve the problem of the state of nature takes private property as its central concern. The golden rule, the social contract for Locke might be said to be, respect all others' property as you would wish them to respect yours, right? Kind of a play on the golden rule, right? A little bit of tongue-in-cheek here. As we will explore below, Rousseau took these authors to be falling into a terrible trap. Locke and Hobbes, he argued, cleverly smuggled the prejudices and values of their political and economic times into their theories of primitive right, into their theories of our primitive origins, what the state of nature looked like. They did this, Rousseau argued, so as to give the impression that the political ideals they defended and argued for in the present were the best fit given our long-gone past and our human nature. In short, telling us who we really are through the biased myth of an original way of life, the state of nature, in a time before civilization, then they then moved on to argue how we should live in the present, right? While, as we shall see, Rousseau's counter-story of our savage ancestors in an ancient prehistory, wandering the forest, is at times unbelievable, right? The goal is less scientific than poetic for Rousseau. That is, to break down the glorification of modern Europe's self-understanding and instead to show how civilization, modern civilization and progress, which we take to be the expression of the highest human forms of accomplishment, is actually little more than a history of terror, injustice, and humiliation. That is, to expose the moral bankruptcy and misery behind the facade of European power and wealth that both Hobbes and Locke endorsed, right? There's a certain conspiracy, right, going on for Rousseau with Hobbes and Locke. Rousseau begins his text by speaking of two kinds of inequality, one physical and one moral. He understands moral inequality as the enjoyment of privileges by some at the expense of others, right? Whether these be in the form of honor or power or wealth. In other words, moral inequality for Rousseau is an unjustified inequality because there is nothing but an arbitrary basis for it. Those that enjoy special privileges do so because do not do so because they have any moral claim on these privileges, but rather because they have some degree of power or wealth that allows them to demand them. In some cases, right, like drinking champagne rather than water, this inequality might not be very significant, might not be very important for us. In other cases, right, such as having political influence or not, or having access to basic necessities like education, food, shelter, medicine, or not, may indeed be very important for the development of human communities and individuals, right? Seeing the degree to which these kinds of important inequalities were widespread and growing in Europe, Rousseau set out to retell the history of how present-day inequality developed, and to ask whether the social contract theory in any way addresses these problems. Hobbes and Locke, Rousseau argued, make the principles of reason, ambition, justice, and property part and parcel of human nature, but he thinks they assume too much in doing so. He wonders what led these philosophers to make these claims and whether we should trust them, right? His answer is short and blunt. Both of these thinkers, Locke and Hobbes, and others like them, speaking continually of need, of avarice, greed, right? Oppression, desires, and pride, have transferred to the state of nature the ideas they acquired in society. They spoke about savage man, and it was actually civil, modern man that they depicted. In actuality, their varying versions of human nature, for Rousseau, have much less to do with human nature and are more a reflection of modern social interests trying to justify, right, trying to legitimate their own greed and ultimately savagery for Rousseau. For Rousseau, these authors have forward a vision of an original psychology and society propped up by scientific and sometimes theological premises which fall short of honesty. In fact, for Rousseau, the British social contract theorists, Locke and Hobbes at the center, presented arguments which conceal their true intent. That is, to justify class privilege, status, and the ascendancy of modern market society, the bourgeois condition, modern market society. Even their use of religion, despite its explicit moral claim, does no more than to command us to believe that since God himself drew men out of the state of nature, they are unequal because God wanted us to be so. Thus, for Rousseau, these views need to be left behind, to be rescinded, in order to grasp the real roots of human nature as opposed to its perversion in the modern world we currently know. We need to think back, again, to the beginning, beyond the philosophical and ideological pretensions and assumptions of the modern world, and without assuming that God or nature made inequality as it is. We should not naturalize inequality, nor normalize it. This exploration after our first nature, Rousseau dedicates as a hymn, a song, in praise of your first ancestors, the criticism of your contemporaries, and the dread of those who have the unhappiness of living after you, right? He's not going to paint a very pretty picture. For Rousseau, we clearly see that our moral glory lives in our past, a remote past, which he takes as a counterexample to the dystopia and devolution, right? The regression which modern injustice implies and reproduces. With this, Rousseau has introduced us to his purpose, his plan, and his presumptions. Clearly, he has drawn up some fairly radical and drastic conclusions, and there are a variety of assumptions that accompany, right, these conclusions, but Rousseau does wear his heart on his sleeve. He's very direct and open about these things, right? We now have to see how he backs up these claims. Rousseau takes it that the original humans in a state of nature were exceptionally vulnerable in comparison to other animals. We were slower and weaker than most and not as well equipped to survive. Yet at the same time, they adapted to their conditions, original humans, and developed the necessary skills. Life in the state of nature for Rousseau made the human constitution robust, physically strong, and children were largely left to fend for themselves on his account, right? Children were maybe raised to the age 2 or 3 or 6 and then kind of sent out on their own, right? Right? All of our anthropological and historical studies reject these assumptions, and I'm going to bring out later that Rousseau's really trying to draw a poetic picture of our original human state. So we shouldn't take this scientifically seriously. And I think even in his day, right, there wasn't great reason to agree with Rousseau's, basically his history, his philosophical anthropology, his historical explication of how humans developed and how we really lived 10,000 or 50,000 years ago, right? He's getting at another point, and I'll bring this up later. While the first humans were more than capable of defending themselves, I went through this, okay. Death came without concern or worry at the time and was not lamented or mourned. People had no great anxiety, a la Hobbes, about what happened to them in the moment or in the future. They died as they lived with little anxiety or reflection on the state of things or on the future. In contrast to this calmness, this ease, the physical and mental illnesses of modern living for Rousseau are many, right? Rousseau's words from the Second Discourse bear recalling here, right? The great inequality in our manner of living, the unwholesomeness of our food, of the food of the poor, right? And today, the food of all, right? Given all the chemicals we pour into our stuff, our food. Together with the excesses of every kind, immoderate transports of every passion, fatigue, mental exhaustion, the innumerable pains and anxieties inseparable from every condition of life. These are two fatal proofs, two terrible proofs, that the greater part of our ills, our problems, are of our own making, and that we might have avoided them nearly all by adhering to that simple, uniform, and solitary, right, living alone, manner of life which nature prescribed, the state of nature. Here Rousseau asks whether the benefits of civilization outweigh the difficulties of our original condition. Should we really have left the state of nature? Was there real gain to be had, or has it been a bad bargain? To what extent has all of our industry and effort to overcome the deficits and injustices of nature, its limitations, scarcity, for example, been simply replaced by other excesses and difficulties which, for Rousseau, may be nothing less than the result of our departure from nature? What has been lost and what gained? Rousseau's conclusion on this question is clear and unequivocal. In following the history of civil society, of civilization, we should also be telling the story of human sickness. In fact, civilization and domesticity have had far more drastic moral consequences than the mere physical ones we sought to eliminate when we departed from nature. For Rousseau, as humankind became sociable and a slave in the civil state, we grew weak, timid, and servile. Our effeminate way of life totally enervated, weakened, drained our strength and our courage. Yet, what brought about our departure from the original condition of nature, right? Why did we leave? For Rousseau, in comparison to other animals, which he considers to be merely machines, right? For Rousseau, other animals don't have a soul. Humans are different in their capacity of free will. Instinct alone does not direct our actions or our thoughts. Unlike animals, right, our free will liberates us from the mechanistic determinism of nature, right? We're not merely machines, we have a degree of freedom. We are creatures of spiritual ends and purposes, not merely natural or material. For Rousseau, physics might be able to explain the mechanism of the senses and ideas, but in the power of willing, volition, intentionality, nothing is to be found but acts which are purely spiritual and wholly inexplicable by the laws of mechanism. There's something spiritual about the choices we make and the way we make them that distinguishes us from the rest of nature. With this spiritualism and reliance upon intuition, Rousseau departs from the main trend of empiricism, which underlies the political thought of Hobbes and Locke, right? For Rousseau, human agency is not reducible to its internal or external environmental causes and effects, and this engenders a certain dignity in humankind. Beyond free will, humans, for Rousseau, share an inherent drive to self-improvement, right? He called it perfectibility, right? This is something specific to human beings, right? Our dignity, our soul. Unlike animals, this internal evolution of the mind means that humans assimilate knowledge, adapt to our conditions, and benefit from developments that imply a real change in our basic nature. Our human nature changes, right? Rousseau shadows the consequences of this substitution for instinct. It would be melancholy, greatly sad, he argues, were we forced to admit that perfectibility is the very source of all human misfortunes. And those misfortunes are the result of our having left the state of nature and departed into the civil state. Okay? In short, it may be the case that substituting the tree of life, the state of nature, with that of knowledge, right, the civil state, is in fact part and parcel of the basis of Rousseau's critique of modern society writ large. Right? There's a certain Christian sense of original sin in our having departed the state of nature for Rousseau, and there was something ideal, pristine, and beautiful that we have lost permanently. Right? He sides with the argument that civilization, in the long run, does a much poorer job of satisfying human wants and needs, producing far more, yes, but at the same time demanding far more than would ever be warranted in nature. It's a lopsided exchange. The incessant activity of modern life, as we shall see, has its roots in a crisis of the social and economic foundations of modern civil life that for Rousseau makes humanity a tyrant, both over himself and over nature, right? Our sciences and reason are really not about human improvement, but about domination. Beyond his language here is a counter-enlightenment, an anti-enlightenment, rejection of reason. That reason itself is merely instrumental, a tool to be used, right? And that in the end, its goal is mastery. Mastery first of nature, and then of humanity itself. Underlying Rousseau's views, then, is a critique of domination itself, where the mirror of nature, the state of nature in this case, is used as a blank slate, a tabula rasa, into which we moderns may look, peer, right, to consider just how morally corrupt we have become when we claim virtue, weak we are where we assume strength, and deformed we have become where we celebrate our normalcy and our progress. Rousseau's concept of perfectibility, the will to progress, seems to have pulled us away from the peace of nature and tragically into the jaws of a cruel and unjust civil society, a civil state. We continue to assume it is progress, but it's actually a trap for Rousseau. Right? We think we're going ahead, but we're going backwards. We started with limited instincts, compensated by our mental faculties, which only develop slowly with the onset of experience, very slowly for Rousseau. And he tells that story very elaborately in sections of the second discourse. Rousseau declares in retrospect, looking backwards, that the original human beings had neither had real reason or incentive to work their way out of nature, right? Their first home. While lacking the foreknowledge of the despair, cruelty, and variety of alienations waiting them in civil society, the original humans of the state of nature weren't aware of the terrible things that was coming insofar as they walked into the civil state. At the same time, that would have been a reason for them, that foreknowledge would have been a reason for them to realize how good they had it, but they didn't have access to that understanding, what was waiting for them in civil society. At the same time, they also lacked any real reason to depart on their own. They more or less satisfied. For Rousseau, there was certainly neither the anxiety and fear that Hobbes reads into the state of nature, nor the philosophizing reason and interests, the rational interests of Locke, to lead them out of the state of nature. In short, these original savages could neither have intellectually gotten to the social contract in the first place, because all the sublime thinking, right, the subtlety of thinking and rationality that Hobbes and Locke require simply were not there in the state of nature. They were not philosophers, certainly as Locke seems to imagine people were in the state of nature in terms of the capacity for reason and what Rousseau calls generalization. Thus, humans were not born philosophers, nor enemies, nor even political animals, if we go as far back as Aristotle. Right? In spite of his later work on the social contract, where he contradicts some of these ideas, the young Rousseau of 1755 insists that the social contract itself has its basis neither in reason nor in nature. Taking issue with Hobbes's view of the state of nature as famously solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, right? It was a terrible place for Hobbes. We have to run away from it. It is not humans nor their actions which make this the case. For Rousseau, at worst, it is the condition of nature which made life difficult in the original state. As Rousseau makes the case, slothful, lazy humans in the state of nature, satisfied their hunger at the first oak, slaking satisfying their thirst at the first brook, finding his bed at the root of the first tree, with that all his wants supplied, right? Savages thus were not unhappy because, unlike us, they were of sound physical constitution, right? They were physically well, and they didn't live with anxiety about the past, the present, or the future. By contrast, the real misery for Rousseau is with us modern, neurotic, anxious modern human beings. Our whole condition of existence is built up around complaint and fatigue for Rousseau. Thus, where instinct satisfied the demands of the state of nature, intellect is never enough to satisfy us in civil society, right? In fact, the whole glory, honor, and power seeking that Hobbes sees going on in the psyche of the savage, right? That's what he sees going on in the state of nature, is actually nothing but a reflection of us, of our modern inclinations and worldview. For Rousseau, there was actually no good or evil in the state of nature, and even less of a basis for all-out war. So Hobbes' story of nasty, poor, brutish, and short isn't about the state of nature for Rousseau. It's actually how we live together, right, in our modern world, right? In truth, our unrepressed well-being in the state of nature was the basis of real virtue and happiness, right? Paradise lost. This simplicity and sense of vital satisfaction, right? What Rousseau calls in the book amour de soi, right? Self-love, happiness merely at being alive. We can hardly conceive of in modern life with its status-seeking, shame, and countless desires, right? With this, Hobbes' conservative view of human nature is rejected. Rousseau insists, let us not conclude with Hobbes that because man has no idea of goodness, he must be naturally wicked. That he is vicious because he does not know virtue, right? We don't have to be Aristotelian students to be able to avoid cruelty and viciousness. In direct contrast with Hobbes, Rousseau implies that the state of nature was in fact the ideal condition to sustain peace between humans, right? Hobbes saw the state of nature as a state of war, as a state of the war of all against all, because he assumed that savage humans are like us, civil ones, greedy, vain, and cruel. Moreover, Hobbes held that modern greed and violence is a direct reflection of our human nature, only of the addition with law and perhaps the police to tame and repress it. But for Rousseau, this is not satisfying, right? And he argues that Hobbes has merely framed a version of the state of nature to normalize modern inequality and injustice, right? Where humans weren't rational in the state of nature, a la Locke, they did not plot against each other, a la Hobbes, and so did not covet power as Hobbes imagines. They could also do no moral harm to each other because they had no concept of harm. They had no concept of injury or insult, and were certainly not glory or honor seeking, right? This is a kind of modern narcissism and ambitiousness that Rousseau is completely absent in the state of nature for Rousseau. More important than this, and a major contribution of Rousseau's psychology here, his vision of human nature, is his position that savages possessed pity and compassion. They sought only their own well-being with the least amount of prejudice to others, right? They sought prejudice to others and their fellows, right? To survive without doing harm to others was the central imperative. Egoism and the vanity which Hobbes speaks of almost without end, right? Where each seeks the highest rank against all others and judge themselves only against others, is a trait of civil society and not of human nature for Rousseau. Thank you. The insult and injury of contempt, which both Hobbes and Locke imagine as a cause of the disorder in the natural state, is not found here, right? The narcissism that both Locke and Hobbes imagine to be existent in the state of nature, which inflames civil strife, simply wasn't there. That's us. The noble savage lived only within its own concern for self-preservation and without reference to the judgment, right, or contempt or resentment of others. Thus, the potential for violence, for revenge, that so motivates other social contract theorists does not concern Rousseau in the least. It is the vanity and honor-seeking of the members of civil society, us, we moderns, and the hierarchies of class society which alone creates the condition for war. That's Hobbes and war, right? The state of nature is the state of war. It is the advancement, the progress of the arts and sciences and the faculty of reason for Rousseau, which shuts off our inner voice of pity, of compassion, and leads us towards a rational self-interest, a calculus, that for Rousseau declares within the philosophical mind of reason, perish if you will, I am secure. Yet the last modern remains of compassion still live in the modern world, and it is with the suffering working classes for Rousseau, who, unrepressed by a surplus of education, of wealth or reason, still have access to moral conscience and passion within feeling, not reason, but feeling. Thus it is not only science, but class as well, social class, socioeconomic class as well for Rousseau, which is responsible for the decadence and regressiveness of modern civil life. The Enlightenment's progress of the mind and the cruelties of class society go hand in hand with one another here. In fact, Rousseau goes as far as to claim that it hasn't been reason that has preserved human society. Reason isn't the cause for our celebrated advance, but rather what little amounts of compassion we still have. Civil society, far from being originated by reason or the laws of nature, as Hobbes and Locke suppose, was in fact the result of the first act of appropriation. Rousseau says, the first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, saying, "This is mine," and found people simple enough, foolish enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society. Right? Harami, I think is the term. A thief. Right? Is that correct? The correct term in Arabic? Harami? To arrive at this termination of the natural condition and the start of civil society, Rousseau elaborates a long development that I'm not going to go into too deeply here. The first inklings, to give you a snapshot, the first inklings of social and civil life start with small collectives based on mutual interest. The surplus of necessities which these affiliations provided created the condition for leisure time, for luxury time. This in turn led to a dependence upon conveniences that reached its summit in the modern world. Needs emerged and multiplied which before were not even wants, and reliance on these conveniences against Bacon led humanity into its current condition, right? More conveniences, more luxuries, more fruits, to use Bacon's term, are of no gain, no benefit to us. In fact, they weaken us, make us dependent upon technology. For Rousseau, the first yoke he inadvertently imposed upon himself and the first source of evils he prepared for his descendants, right? The creation of private property and ultimately the luxuries of technology ultimately created this condition of our dependence and the yoke that he speaks of, right? Enslavement. The division of labor of the civil state enriched some but impoverished most. This inequality inherent in market society inevitably affected the lives of individuals who began to sink or rise with a tide of exchange and accumulation, right? We have the creation of the first act of private property, and then we have a whole society arranged around private property. Not merely social, the division of society into classes and rank had direct psychological implications for the individual. Misery, despair, and alienation became the norms of modern social existence. For those who sink low on the ladder of power and wealth, there is permanent contempt within society. And we know this to be true today, right? Unable any longer to provide for ourselves and completely dependent on the judgment of more powerful people in society. A terrible economy of respect and status emerges that serve to destine some for greatness, but most to misery. Rousseau tells us that it now became the interest of men to appear what they really were not. To be and to seem became two totally different things, right? This performance of the self makes us all into slaves where the poor can only know and fend for themselves through the power of the wealthy. And the wealthy become wholly dependent upon the poor and their skills in labor. This tragic theater, right, civil society, as a tragic theater of mutual dependency and the unequal field upon which it was played, led to the modern condition where humans take each other as a means, right, and never as an ends. While savages were no Kantian ethicists or agents of goodwill, yet neither did they seek to take others as a thing to be exploited, right? They didn't need to learn not to take others as a means to an end, right? They simply didn't take others that way. They were simply concerned with their own survival, with the minimum amount of harm to others, right, as a result of compassion. This, however, right, this ambitiousness, mutually exclusive ambitiousness for Rousseau becomes the norm in civil society. We only grow and advance insofar as others are weakened. Turning upside down Hobbes's depiction of our abusive and aggressive original nature, Rousseau conveys that in civil society, the desire to surpass others inspired all men with a vile, terrible propensity to injure one another, and with a secret jealousy, which is the more dangerous as it puts on the mask of benevolence, of kindness, right? In short, civil virtue and friendship become parasitism and competition for Rousseau. Civil law becomes the domination of class, and civil order law becomes the normalization of the power of some through the permanent submission of the many. This state of war, the state of civil society, he tells us, was the first effect of property and the inseparable attendance of growing inequality. Out of this, the wealthy, using their old slaves to acquire new, thought of nothing but subduing and enslaving their neighbors, like hungry, ravenous wolves, which having once tasted human flesh, despise every other food, and then thenceforth seek only men to devour, right? Whatever pleasures or joys might have come to us within the state of nature are surpassed by this desire for self-advancement that comes at the expense of others, right? In civil society. In the midst of the chaos of early civil society, where property was appropriated only to be stolen by others, right? Locke and Hobbes. The powerful conspired under the banner of justice to secure their power and interests. A contract, Rousseau tells us, which formed the civil state in the name of the weak and property. In a blink of an eye, the Hobbesian conspiracy of the state was created by the social contract in the name of the defense of virtue and peace for Rousseau, right? So what Rousseau's telling us here, to kind of unpack this a little bit, is that the idea of justice, of the state, of civil society, and the protection of the weakest is actually, for him, the conspiracy of the powerful, to make the weak accept the law of the powerful, right? And, right, this is echoing Thrasymachus, actually, in Book 1 of the Republic, right, who says that might makes right and that justice is actually the prerogative of the stronger, of the powerful. Rousseau tells us, in this tragic bargain, Rousseau tells us that all ran headlong into their chains in hopes of securing their liberty, right? The new promise of the civil state, which bound new fetters, new chains on the poor, and it gave new powers to the rich. Eternally fixed the law of property and inequality, and subjected all mankind to perpetual labor, slavery, and wretchedness. Right? Where civil society first set itself up as a just remedy to the instability and rule of the jungle, the state of nature, it had returned to the same only to make permanent and more secure the advantages of the stronger. We've gone full circle, right? Here then, civilization itself became the ordered institutionalization of domination for Rousseau. In fact, his analysis goes further, for beneath the various layers of inequality, Rousseau sees wealth as the common denominator and class power as its outcome. With such an analysis, Rousseau claims that we are enabled to judge pretty exactly how far a people have departed from its primitive condition, the state of nature, and of its progress towards the extreme term of corruption, right? Progress moving towards further corruption, right? Echoing the work of Karl Marx that was to come a century later, Rousseau tells us that universal desire for reputation, honors, and advancement inflames, excites, and multiplies our passions by creating universal competition and rivalry, right? Market society. Among men, numberless failures, successes, and disturbances of all kinds by making so many aspirants run the same course. Right? Anticipating Hegel and G.W.F. Hegel and Karl Marx's thoughts on alienation and competition by many years, the basic elements of Rousseau's dense and rich analysis of the crisis of the modern condition of civil society are still the talking points of many of our most respected critical thinkers and public intellectuals today. Imagine how much more difficult it must have been for Rousseau to stand up amongst his Enlightenment peers in this way. No doubt, this in part explains the tortured social and personal life and loneliness and regret which Rousseau led, right? A life of loneliness and regret. The schadenfreude, right, or sadistic pleasure we take from the weakness and suffering of others, only in comparative relation with our own well-being, is the hallmark of this set of circumstances for Rousseau, right? This parasitism, psychological parasitism, and emotional parasitism of modern social life. With this, Rousseau's cycle of civil society is completed, and the many are returned to the same rule of the strongest that had been declared as the reason for the departure from nature in the first place. This time, though, they are subjected to a far more cruel and merciless master, right? This is the terrible failure for Rousseau of the shackles into which Hobbes and Locke's glorification of civil society delivers us, right? Let me bring this to a close. In 1750, 5 years prior to the publication of his discourse on the origins of inequality, the young Rousseau, and even younger Rousseau, first unleashed his assault upon Enlightenment, science, and reason in his now famous Discourse on the Arts and Sciences. Actually, it was then famous, won a great award at the time. There, Rousseau, in the Discourse on Arts and Sciences, 5 years prior to the Discourse on Equality, Rousseau argued that the sciences, letters, and arts spreads flowers over the iron chains with which men are burdened, stifle in us, repress within us the sense of original liberty, make us love our slavery into what is called civilized peoples. In both texts, the first and second discourse, first on the arts and sciences, the second discourse being on inequality, both texts, the analysis of the moral and spiritual crisis which the modern sciences and private property brought about is understood as a fundamentally social and political one. His critical assessment of the progress of the Enlightenment is really a reflection on the political and economic transformations that drove feudal Europe through to political, economic, and scientific modernity, right? Something's been lost in the bargain, and Rousseau is a romantic longing for the past. Behind the seeming wisdom and humanist contributions of science, Rousseau saw the aspirations of power and domination over nature and social life. Right? Science he saw just as a cover story for an attempt to gain more control over and mastery over our fellow man and as well as nature. Behind the moral and ethical claims of the Enlightenment, Rousseau saw the justification of new forms of class power, seeking to replace the old and ensure their monopoly into the future. Right? Great fairy tale. Yet while Rousseau's critical stance would influence a major revolution, the French, as well as the Romantic movements in art and literature in the 19th century, and thinkers down to our own day, there is no doubt a variety of ways in which we can take issue with some of his claims. Right? Let's be a little bit critical here. To be sure, Rousseau's appeal to us is as much to the heart as it is to the head. And while we can agree with the broad strokes of his commentary, his retelling of the development of the history of pre-social humans, of prehistoric humans, into civilized ones, bears at least one major rectification, one major clarification. That is, it is unlikely, right, that there was ever a time, a human past, that did not include, one, language, and number two, social communal experience, right? And this is his imagination of, noble savages wandering alone without children or companions within the state of nature amongst the trees as their primary companions. His notion of hermits wandering the land and sleeping in trees with merely happenstance encounters with one another seems more than far-fetched, right? It seems bordering the ridiculous. Despite these deformities in his thought, and the fact that such lonely nomadism, right, the nomadism that he imagines in the state of nature, is actually more likely a representation of Rousseau's own social and emotional life than our early ancestors, right? This noble savage, to a great extent, is really a reflection of Rousseau's state. He was a very lonely, lost, disenchanted, and often rejected character amongst his peers, his intellectual peers. Right? Had a hard time keeping friends. Despite this, it does not detract from a far more important observation, right? That this noble savage is actually far more about Rousseau's, kind of confession of Rousseau, a kind of autobiography, than it is about our human ancestors. There is a far more important observation to be held on to here. The portrait of the modern soul which Rousseau painted against this backdrop of a fictitious past state of nature struck and continues to strike home in a devastating way, forcing us to ask what part of ourselves we have surrendered to modern life and whether we gain, right? Whether the gains merit these losses, whether it's been a net loss in this process of having left and what we've left behind of ourselves, of our human nature, of an original human nature. Many in the tradition of political philosophy have sought to diminish, right, the stature of Rousseau's early works, the first and second discourses, in favor of his latter and more mature works, such as the Social Contract. Despite this, many are led back to his passionate outcry as a therapy for our own personal and political crises within the modern world, as well as a remedy to the fictions of progress recycled by the powers of the present. With that, thank you for your patience and enjoy the rest of your semester. Thank you.